All right, so we're going to talk about the U.S. and Canada. We're going to keep our discussion going that we had on North America. And just kind of some concepts I want to look at as we go through this. Again, this is on your Google Classroom, so if you want to follow along with that, that's fine. The notes, I'm kind of treating you like, you know, the approaching college-age students that you are. Some of you will be in college classes next year, so need to be able to figure stuff out and kind of let you figure out what you need to write down and what you don't need to write down. There's a few things I will tell you you definitely need, but a lot of this stuff I just need you to figure out how to do it on your own with shorthand, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the key concepts of physical, political, social, and economic concepts when we look at North and South America. So how are they different than other places, particularly Canada and the United States? Yes, Mexico is part of North America, but culturally it's something different. So we're going to, we're going to do it in Latin America. We're going to look at push and pull factors. You remember those from 7th and 8th grade, right? We're talking about migration. What's a push factor? Anybody?
For migration?
Yeah.
Like weather change.
Okay. Something bad that pushes you out of a country,
Drought.
like droughts, bad weather, drought, famine. Could be political upheaval, war, religious persecution, right? What's a pull factor with immigration?
Good soil. Good
Okay.
weather.
Anything good that makes you come. So
Possible.
flip all that, right? Good weather, lots of jobs, no war, no political persecution, no religious persecution. Okay? The U.S. has a lot of pull factors, as does Canada, because people from all over the world come here for the degree, particularly of political, economic, and religious freedom that we have. Okay? And that's for the U.S. and Canada. We're going to look at how economically we are linked to other countries. And finally, we're going to look at interdependence. What does that word interdependence mean? That's an SAT word, interdependent.
Like you depend.
You can have your own beliefs and do what you want.
That's independent.
It's like you depend on each other.
Yes, this is kind of the, independent is on my own, alone. Interdependent is where we need each other and we use things from each other. Give you an example. You've all got televisions at home, right? There are no televisions made in the United States. Not one anywhere in the world. TVs are not made here. We're pretty interdependent for TVs. Okay? Our vocabulary. You need to be able to use all of these terms. Now, do you have to write them all down? Well, if I know what the word is, I probably won't write it down, but you need to be able to recognize it. Like, for instance, the first one is migration. I know it's hard to read, guys. I apologize. When it changed from one PowerPoint version to another, it changed all my colors and sizes and everything. It's a little weird. Migration is the movement from one place to another. Now, we always think of migration as being something animals do, but do people migrate?
Yes.
Absolutely. Y'all did a map on Thursday of last week called The United States Grows, where you did the 13 colonies, and then you did the growth over the Appalachian Mountains. Then you did the Louisiana Purchase, and you saw how we spread west. That's a migration map, okay? So we're going to look at migration. We've already talked about push and pull factors. That's just what drives people away from one place and what attracts them to another. Super important in geography. We will always, always, always deal with push and pull factors for a region. Number 3, natural hazard. Natural hazard. That could be some of your nicknames. We could call you natural hazard. What's a hazard?
Volcanoes.
That's dangerous.
Could be anything that's dangerous, anything that gets in the way. Well, a natural hazard is one that's made by nature. Volcanoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes. And we're going to look at which natural hazards are big in North America. And it kind of depends on what region you're in, right? What's the biggest natural hazard to us here in East Texas?
Tornadoes.
Tornadoes, flooding, heat exhaustion, heat. Not so bad here. That tends to be more in mountainous areas, but it could happen. But if you lived over in like California, you'd put earthquakes on there. If you lived in Hawaii, you put volcanoes and earthquakes on there. If you lived down in Galveston, you'd put hurricanes. You know, you got to think about these. There's different natural disasters for different places, okay? Or natural hazards. Capitalism and market economy. Now, you all know what capitalism is, although you've probably not thought about it much, because Miss Thistlebottom never used that word much with you whenever she taught you history when you were growing up. But capitalism is our economic system. Capitalism is just an economic system where there's free trade, where you can enter and leave a trade anytime you want to. And there's private ownership of business. What I think is cool about capitalism is it's the only time I can think of where I can point at my mother and go, "You were wrong." My mom's a smart lady, but she taught me from day one, greed is bad. Son, greed's bad, don't be greedy. And then I went and took an economics class and went, man, in capitalism, greed's what makes everything work. Greed is good in that system. Now, that doesn't mean, go beat up your neighbor and take what they have. But greed is what makes capitalism work, because if I'm an employer and I'm trying to employ you, I want to employ you at the cheapest rate I can. And you want to work for me, you want to work for me at the highest rates you can. So we're both greedy trying to get what we want, and in the end, what happens? We negotiate a price where I'm willing to pay you to work and you're willing to work for that pay. The same thing can be true about when you go to the grocery store. At some point, your mother or dad has reached an agreement with the grocery store where that gallon of milk is worth more than that $2 they have in their pocket, okay? Everybody's being greedy in this. Everybody's trying to keep their own. But at a certain point, you figure out what's more valuable to you. Does that make sense? Yes, no, maybe?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. The Gulf Stream. Anybody ever been on a cruise? No?
There you go.
I went on a cruise out of Galveston a few years ago, and I've been on a cruise in a Navy ship a few times. But when you get out there so far in the Gulf, you hit that Gulf Stream, and the water stops being that nasty, gray, murky water that you see at Galveston, and all of a sudden it's crystal clear and the brightest blue you'll ever see. That's the Gulf Stream, okay? And that's this stream that carries you through, and it carries all the way from the Gulf out into the Atlantic Ocean, and it carries all the way up the coast eventually. And as it cools off, it stops being the Gulf Stream, and you get what they call the North Atlantic Drift. But it's just this current that flows around this area. And it's some of the most beautiful water you'll ever see. Take a cruise one day. Take a cruise. And if you do, take me with you. Make sure it's a casino boat, so I have something to do besides watch the shows. You're thinking about it, aren't you? Yeah, see, she's got plans for me. All right, another reminder for you, Columbian Exchange. More 8th grade stuff coming at you. What's the Columbian Exchange named after?
Columbus.
Christopher Columbus, right? And what is it?
Bless you.
Trade between
I
Europe,
remember that.
Asia, and North America.
It was like his trade routes where he would take this stuff and trade it over there to get stuff that they needed, but over here it's a big circle.
There you go, you're both right. It's the exchange of goods between Europe and Asia and the Americas, right? And Africa. Excuse me. Now, Columbian Exchange is one of the most important things that's ever happened in all of history. It changed the world. Think about how different life would be without it. If you were a Mesoamerican, an American before Columbus, let's say, what are some things that you would definitely never have seen? You've never seen a cow, a sheep, a pig, a horse. None of that stuff, ever. That would change the whole world without that stuff. You never have seen armor or gunpowder, white man for that reason. There's just a bunch of things that were different. Now, if you're a European, think about how much the Americans changed Europe. When I think of Italy, I think of Italian food. Love Italian food. And you can't have Italian food without tomatoes. Right? I mean, you've got to have some kind of a tomato in your Italian food. Except tomatoes are from Central America. Right? There were no tomatoes up here for the Italians to have food until after Columbus. That wasn't that long. That was 500 years ago, guys.
Oh yeah, it wasn't that long.
But historically, that's not a very long time. Chocolate, corn, some types of rice, tomatoes, potatoes changed the whole world. This Columbian Exchange is super important. Of course, there's also things like diseases that went back and forth. Whooping cough and smallpox came from Europe and wiped out the Americans. Syphilis came from America and hit Europe pretty hard, particularly France. But this happens, and it changed the way the world is, okay? Absolutely changed everything. This is a topographic chart of the United States. If you were a giant laying down south of the United States and were just looking at it sideways, you're laying in the Gulf looking at it, this is what the U.S. would look like. East Coast, West Coast. So you'd be coming west and you'd have to cross the Appalachian Mountains. This was our first big obstacle to westward expansion. Does it look like a very big obstacle? Not by today's standard, not by what we know. This was a big obstacle, okay? This stopped people from going west for a long time. And then you have the Central Plains, all that area that's drained by the Mississippi River. That whole area drains into here. You come out the Great Plains and you climb the Rocky Mountains. Massive Pikes Peak up here, right? Come back down to the Colorado River. So this would be the base of the Grand Canyon. Look at the difference, Grand Canyon, Pikes Peak. Okay? Texas. Then you get up here and you climb more mountains and you come down into the Great Basin. This is where like Salt Lake City is and that kind of stuff. Then you climb the Sierra Nevada mountains back down, and you have the coastal ranges, and you're back on the Pacific Ocean. Okay? So, which mountains are the tallest? Rocky Mountains. What are the second tallest mountain ranges? Sierra Nevada. And the third? Appalachians. Very good. So, Rockies, Sierra Nevada, Appalachians. All right, so major climates. We got a bunch of climate zones in North America. And in fact, we probably should be several different countries and not just one big nation. There's a tropical wet climate. This is most of the southeast United States. It includes us here in East Texas. We're a tropical wet climate. What does that mean? It means hot and humid, lots of rain. Would that define us? Yeah, absolutely. Defines like Houston and New Orleans really well, but it defines us too. Then you have the humid continental area that's up there around the Great Lakes area. And this is an area where it's still very humid because the Great Lakes have a lot of evaporation and that water stays there. But it's a continental climate. It's inside the continent. It's a long way from the ocean. you don't have that moderating effects of the ocean. So you have extreme temperatures where it gets much, much colder there. This is where like Chicago and Milwaukee are. You go a little further up north, you get what we call the subarctic region. What's sub mean? Sub.
Hello.
Below, right? So this is the area just below the Arctic. If this is the Arctic, this is the subarctic, okay? Stretches across North America, most of Canada and Alaska, and it goes from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Think a lot of people live in this area? No, a lot smaller. There's a small group that's Arctic, that's up there even higher, a very small group, not much at all, where they're actually above the Arctic Circle, in Greenland and parts of Canada, a little bit of Alaska, but most of the people are going to live down in the subarctic area. Then you get out in the western parts, and it's just everything. It's chaos over there. Because of the mountains, the climate's going to just do strange things. Because the two things that affect your climate is your latitude and your altitude. So the further you get away from the equator, the colder it gets. But also, the further you get away from the Earth's surface, the colder it gets. So if you get a long way away from the equator and really high, it's miserable, okay? So you can have all these different climate zones that happen. You'll have marine west coast, you'll have a continental climate, you'll have a Mediterranean climate, you'll have a semi-arid desert climate. It'll all be in this region. And it's mostly elevation that causes it. What's an ecosystem?
Let's plant the animal live.
It's how plants and animals interact, right? And there's a bunch of ecosystems in our country. First is the temperate grassland area. That's going to be in the Central Plains. So this area here is kind of the temperate grassland area. And, excuse me, this is a good area for farming. It's also a great area for ranching. Very, very big ranching area. If you go further southwest, think of Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado, Utah, you can get high desert at Chaparral. And this is where, if you don't know what chaparral is, it's like a small woody plant. A lot of times they've got thorns on them. They don't require a whole lot of water. You want to know what chaparral looks like? Think about every John Wayne movie you ever saw growing up. That's where they're always filmed, is in high chaparral, okay? Much of North America is covered by forest, whether that be coniferous or deciduous forest. Y'all know the difference between coniferous trees and deciduous trees?
Yeah, I can't remember.
If they lose their leaves every year at fall, the big leaves they lose, they're deciduous. If they produce a cone and have needles, they're coniferous. Okay? What kind of forest do we have here in East Texas?
Pines.
Technically, we're a mixed forest. But if I were to get in my car and drive between here and Tyler down 69 and knew nothing else except what I saw, we're a coniferous forest place. It's nothing but pine trees, right? That's what we see everywhere. Would it shock you to discover that pine trees are not native to here?
For real?
Pine trees do not come from here. Pine trees come from Alabama, Mississippi, southern Georgia. But when the first settlers came here, they moved westward and they brought those pine trees with them. And pine trees grow faster than deciduous trees. So they planted pine plantations in order to make money, to create a timber industry. And over the last 100 years, as we have cleared our deciduous forests, as we've cut down our oaks and our elms and all this, we've replaced it mostly with pine trees, because in the timber industry you can get a return on your investment much faster on pine than you can anywhere else. If you were to plant pine trees today, if you had some land, it's expected that you can get your first thinning in 10 years. And then every 5 years after that, you should be able to get a cutting. Now, if you plant that in oak trees or maple, well, not maple, but oak trees, your grandkids will get to have a thinning when you're dead, because they grow very, very slow. So for purposes of economic planning, we replant in pine trees. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know, but that's what we do. And then if you get up here in the northern part, you have tundra. Tundra is where the ground is at least partially frozen, okay? The water actually freezes in the ground. All right, so the United States runs on what we call the petrodollar. What that means is our whole economy is based in oil. Oil and natural gas, fossil fuels, okay? And here's the problem. The US and Canada are two of the world's largest energy producers. But we're not two of the world's largest countries. We're kind of greedy in how we use energy, okay? We're very greedy. The U.S. is purchasing 90% of all the electricity that Canada produces because we can't produce enough ourselves. We're buying electricity because of how much stuff we need. And they're producing it through hydroelectricity more in Canada than we are. We're almost exclusively fossil fuels in the United States. So burning coal or burning oil. What's the problem with that? It's bad for the environment, that's true. It's also a limited resource. It's not going to last forever. It's getting better. We're doing a little better. We've got solar, got a little wind, a little bit of hydroelectric, but we're still by far more dependent on fossil fuels than anywhere else in the world. And if you look at these numbers, you can see where our consumption has been climbing and climbing and climbing. This is through the year 2000. The average American uses as much energy as 2 Germans, 7 Syrians, look at that at the bottom, 286 Ethiopians.
What's an Ethiopian
Ethiopia, North Africa. 101 Haitians, 24 Indians, 12 Colombians. We're using a lot of electricity, okay? Don't worry about getting that down, that's not that important.
Wait, why do we use so much and they barely use any?
Because we have more technology. We air condition our houses and heat and cool, and they're starving to death. It's a third world country versus an industrialized country. Carbon dioxide emissions in the 10 largest countries in the world. What is carbon dioxide?
Stuff that comes out of our vehicles
And our mouths. CO2 is what you take oxygen in, you put CO2 out, carbon dioxide. But the problem is CO2 provides, in large amounts, will provide a shield that traps heat in, okay? So if you put too much CO2 out, you warm the earth up. And that's a fact, okay? People that say global warming doesn't happen, they're lying to themselves. Global warming does happen. Now, that having been said, do I think global warming is all man-made? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We've always had warming. But at least partially, CO2 is responsible. And if you look at these numbers, the US, our next biggest competitor is China at about 3,500 metric tons, actually 35 million metric tons, because that's in thousands, versus 58 million metric tons, okay? Russia's way down over here, Japan. These are our major industrial powers. We're number one. We're also the wealthiest country in the world. So we can afford to do that. Now, does that mean we have the wealthiest people? No. There are places there are places with wealthier people. But as a whole country, we are wealthier. What?
So how come we're wealthier, but yet we're still in debt to China?
Well, there's a difference between the wealth of the people of a country and the wealth of a nation. Our nation is poor, but the people have a lot of money. It's a good point.